I think we have the permission to start. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you to our hosts for this incredible venue. And I'm going to commit the ultimate moderator sin and go on and on about actually diving into the discussion, but I do have our speaker's permission to do it. Last time, I was in one of the beautiful venues of this incredible event. It was 2019 BC, before COVID, when Coda, the newsroom I represent, co-hosted a discussion about the importance of covering rewriting of history and how journalists can do better at covering the historical revisionism. As a thematic newsroom, rewriting of history has been one of the key elements of our coverage of disinformation crisis. We have been tracking stories of authoritarians and populists around the world manipulating the past in order to, and distorting narratives in order to gain more power. And back then in 2019, I played a clip from a project that we had just finished at the time. It was called Generation Gulag, and it was a series of mini documentaries that featured a few remaining survivors of Stalin's gulags, Stalin's labor camps. And the films were not so much about the past and the horrors of the past and of what they've been through, but the horror of living a life in which that past is being denied to you in a country that is run by a government that is airbrushing history and whitewashing Soviet atrocities. For us at Coda, it was really, the whole project was really a love child. You know, our team, we all worked on it, but there was one journalist who was the driving force behind it, whose journalism powered it, who found all of the survivors, who was the field producer, who did all of the interviews, and for whom that project was more personal and more important than any of the rest of us in the team. Her name was Oksana Baulina, and just over a week ago, Oksana was killed in Kiev by a Russian missile. She died documenting the real-life consequences of the narrative that Vladimir Putin has been pushing out to the world. So I think, I checked the numbers today, and they've gone up. Oksana is now one of 18 journalists who have died in just over a month of this war. And I think this being a journalist festival, it will be appropriate for us to just take a moment of silence to let that number sink in. '18 is an astonishing number, and we owe all of them, I think, and every journalist who is on the front lines of that war, who is in Ukraine at the moment, a huge debt of gratitude. We especially owe Ukrainian journalists who do not have the luxury of getting out. They're doing the most important job that currently there is in journalism. The other front line in this war that is incredibly important that I hope to talk about today is the work that the Russian journalists are doing, trying to get through that deafening noise of disinformation and lies that are coming out of the Kremlin. And many of them are doing that from exile. You will notice that, we don't have any of the reporters who are on the ground here today, or we don't have a Russian journalist here today, and it's partially intentional because they're busy. They've got more important things to do. But it's also because, like, one thing I really hope to talk to Peter and Jane about today are all the other front lines of this war that are there around the world, are less obvious than the front lines that lie in Ukraine. And one thing, my first question, I can't think of two better people to talk about those other front lines than Jane and Peter, and your list of accomplishments and your bios are just, too long to list, but they're available and they're online, so hopefully, I'll jump straight into it. But before I ask the first question, I want to kind of ask for a favor. So there is an old broadcast trick, which is to actually imagine a listener whom you're talking to when you're broadcasting, the physical person. So last night I was having dinner with an Indian friend and a colleague who, was very politely and thoughtfully resentful of the attention that this war is getting in the West. The first question that I want to ask you, Peter, is obviously this war is the biggest thing that's happening in your life, in my life, in Jane's life. It is the most important thing. But how do you explain its importance to people who have lived through their own wars, have their own colonial experiences, and their own conflicts?
Yeah, I had to take a trip to Texas in the second or third week of the war, and I don't think any Texans had any kind of emotional connection to what was going on, and maybe it was a story on television, but they saw absolutely no relevance of it to their lives. And I live in the US, and actually I don't think in most of the US there's a connection, let alone India. I think that's our jobs, though. I think when we think about the role of journalists today, it's finding those connections and surfacing them. What's been very interesting in this particular war is that there actually has been am I drifting in and out? Do I do this? There has actually been a reaction already showing interesting connections. Remember, right at the start of the war, the UN representative from Kenya immediately got it. He was like, okay, this is a colonial conflict. We know exactly what this is. The Ukraine-Kenyan connection is not one that people have made. I spent, like probably many people here, quite a lot of some time focusing on Syria, and was trying for years to get Syrians and Ukrainians to talk to each other. It was, from the Kremlin's point of view, it's the same. And that connection didn't really exist in any deep way. It's been very interesting to see how instantaneously Syrians have shown sympathy to the Ukrainians, from helping in things like, in emergency services and giving sort of informal advice, but also seeing the connection between Aleppo and Mariupol. So people are getting it. They are seeing these interconnections. I think it's really up to us as journalists to find those things. And I think we live generally in a very odd new world where all these new lines are possible. So I don't know, for example, when I was covering something that Jane is much more an expert on, which is sort of disinformation and troll farms, I found that suddenly there was a mutual understanding between journalists in the Philippines and in St. Petersburg. Two countries that had never thought of themselves as one thing. So that's kind of, I did write an essay for your wonderful publication, Coda, which is all about this, all about how our job today is to find these interconnections. So it's finding those points, but then it's also thinking about the larger sort of principles at stake. This is, on one hand, a local conflict. It is a bigger geopolitical conflict, but it's also a conflict about, and here we need to think about what sort of rights are being ruined. Yeah? When Putin's wars, or what's happened in Syria, what's happened in Yemen, what is it just war crimes we're talking about? Is that what unites these things? So it's finding these sort of cultural interconnections, and then I think thinking about what that means in terms of rights. And I think we're slightly figuring that out still. What exactly is, I don't know, Putin up to in terms of what he's trying to destroy? Clearly humanitarian norms, clearly war crimes, but I think there's something bigger going on, which I think does resonate, which is kind of trying to wipe out the right to have a Ukrainian identity and the right for people to have their own meaning, sort of a right to exist. And I think that's something that's playing out in all sorts of places across the world. But this is our job. This is, I think, our mission as journalists to look for it. It's not easy, and it means understanding other perspectives. It means listening as much as talking, which is not something we're always that good at. So, I don't know, how far did you get with your Indian friend?
I mean, that's the challenge is, you know, he was actually very careful, and it's not just him. I mean, this is a conversation I have with Arab colleagues and friends, with others, and sort of like, how do you have, and he was very much, many of them are very careful about not going into whataboutry. I mean, these are not the kind of people who do, you know, well, what about this and what about that? I mean, there is, you know, I'm not talking about these people. I'm talking about people who are thoughtful and understanding, but say, but there are all these other issues that we haven't addressed before that we should be addressing. And is this that I don't think I got very far because I don't know if I can, like, how to have that conversation, really. Any tips from you, Jane? Jump in.
I mean, I think already the sort of the Syria-Ukraine connection shows that there is ways to do this. Of course, Yemen should be part of that conversation. I think the Ukraine-Kenya connection. So I see all these very interesting connections happening. I also see very interesting connections for the other side. You know, the dictatorial connections are new. You know, the South African government and Russia, obviously China. India is just such a special case because it has its own history and its own strategy of survival, which has always been to kind of like dodge and weave a little bit. And of course, there's huge, very understandable sort of, you know, legacies of colonialism. So I wonder if in India might be a particularly tough nut to crack.
I'm turning to you for wisdom.
You know, one of the amazing things that you'll see at a lot of protests in support of Ukraine is this coalition of extremely angry people, right? And it's not just people who have been impacted by Russia's conduct in the world directly, which of course we see. We see a lot of people from Belarus, from Kazakhstan, from Syria, but we also see this coalition of activists who understand the bigger global currents that Russia has contributed to. I was at a protest in front of Stonewall where queer Americans said, we must support Ukraine because we see the amount of work Ukraine has been able to do around LGBTQ rights. I see people who do climate work support Ukraine because they understand the impact of Russian oil on the world. And as with any war, there are a lot of really difficult threads that converge to make it possible. And I think our job as reporters is to pull at those threads, show those threads, and help people understand not just the impossible fight of Ukrainian people themselves, but also how this war is enabled. And hopefully transfer that knowledge to other wars, other revolutions, and set some sort of precedent in terms of what we are and aren't willing to accept as a global community.
So, and you just named some of the, basically what I mentioned earlier, the front lines of this war that there are less obvious, whether it's climate change or whether it's LGBTQ rights and so on, these currents that run through it. Do you have any practical advice for newsrooms for whose audiences are, far away from this conflict, for newsrooms, for Italian journalists? How do you cover this war and make it relevant to local audiences?
Every country, every neighborhood even, is going to have their own perspective on what is happening. And reporters outside of Ukraine, newsrooms outside of Ukraine have an incredibly important role to play. And that role is really telling the smaller human and also the larger political stories that contribute to how we see and understand the war. One incredible thing that I've personally witnessed is this very organic effort, volunteer effort, that is happening anywhere there's a Ukrainian community, where church basements and people's houses and unused warehouses are being filled up with boxes and boxes of humanitarian aid, right? Those boxes are being sent to Ukraine through logistical operations that essentially sprung up overnight. And not just that, but Ukrainians are physically taking suitcases, bringing them to the border in Warsaw or in Poland, and are bringing them back over to Ukraine. Like little ants. I can't get this image of ants, dumping resources into their anthill. But there's also bigger conversations happening that we've been having over the last years, right? Decades. Conversations around social media, around disinformation and propaganda and its impact on society, and about what war actually means on a human level. Of course, for those on the ground in Ukraine, but also the families who haven't slept in 43 days, trying to make sure that their friends, their loved ones, people they worry for are okay.
Peter, I want to follow up with you on the same question, but meantime, unfortunately, we can't have audience questions because of the COVID regulations, but I am looking at my phone, so please DM me. I'm at Antalava, just my last name. It's on the program, ANTLAVA. So DM me, my DMs are open, and I'll try my best if you have questions for either Peter or Jane. Peter, in terms of practical advice for newsrooms and journalists on how do you do it? How do you make these connections and how do you tell these stories? What's your advice? I mean, this is being listened to by Italian journalists in Italy, translated into Italian. What are stories that Italian newsrooms should be doing that are, relevant to they're about this war and relevant to their audiences?
Well, I mean, sort of my life took a strange turn a few years ago, and I've sort of become sort of semi-academic, where I think a lot about the connection between media and audiences, and how do you reach new audiences? How do you reach audiences that might be resistant to evidence and knowledge? And actually, we've done projects together with Corriere della Sera in Italy. I think that journalists are perfectly capable of making these connections through things like research and a bit of audience analysis. The problem is not that, the problem is incentives. That was very, very clear in the work we've done with newsrooms across the world. But especially in Italy, where the ad tech market really drives things, and subscription is still quite new, or was when we were working here. And sadly, that just puts you into this kind of very, very, very bad cycle where, you're constantly looking for very sort of short-term, subjects that are inflammatory and polarizing. So that's problematic. I think journalists are perfectly capable of finding these things. Are there incentives in place to do this? Not really, no, because it would almost always be slower, more background kind of stories, more deeper, which is actually very good. People really like that. in terms of like when we look at, audience responses to the deeper sort of contextualization. I'll give you an example. And it's not just our research. Remember the migrant crisis, which was a really big deal here, the refugee crisis. It was, Matteo Salvini really preyed on this. When various researchers looked into the question of what got the most sort of calm response from people, what got people to think about the subject in a calm way, it was background explainers. Why is there a crisis? What's happening in the Middle East? Like any type of therapy, you don't say it's good or bad. You start going, why is it happening, and look for solutions. And with this Ukraine crisis, with this invasion of Ukraine, again, you'd look at Russia's hold over Italian energy. You'd look at corruption in the Italian system. You'd look at all these things which would explain to you why the Kremlin felt empowered and enabled to do its invasion. However, that kind of like explanatory journalism isn't the one that's going to get the most likes and shares. Most likes and shares is going to be the one that says Putin is sexy or Putin's evil, which is a moral choice, and even I feel kind of excited by that choice. But that's not actually taking us forward into sort of a deeper understanding. So yeah, we are slightly trapped in this very bad cycle, I think.
Yeah, and obviously the social media platforms are a really big part of the cycle. I was in London last week and talking to a 14-year-old family member, nephew, who said to me, "Is the war over?" And I said, "No, it's not." And he said, "Well, it's completely disappeared from my TikTok." And of course, that's all about like a nanoseconds less that he spent looking at it. This is the case with all the other algorithms. I mean, you have done incredible work on disinformation on social media platforms and the role that they play. What is that role in this conflict?
So if I can start from a little bit far away, 8 years away. In 2014, we Ukrainians had a revolution. That Ukrainian revolution filled social media feeds. In fact, many of the media outlets that were founded in 2014 are now doing the work about the full-scale invasion now. And it was so visual and it was so powerful, right? You had Ukrainian protesters lighting cigarettes with Molotov cocktails, right? You had these barricades in the middle of big historic buildings, and you had a lot of support for Ukraine. When the revolution was over, the war began, the same war that we're talking about right now. First, with the annexation of Crimea, and then with Russia's military backing of separatists in Donbass. And what happened was that the beginning of the war and the beginning of the invasion created the ideal opportunity for Russian disinformation to work. Because the images of lionized, brave Ukrainians disappeared from social media feeds. And instead, propaganda about this being a regional conflict or who's Crimea, who does Crimea belong to anyway? The answer is Ukrainians. To the muddied waters around the downing of MH17, right? And what we saw then was a cycle, an attention cycle and a cycle of a poor social media response. The attention cycle drifted away from Ukraine after the revolution. And as the attention drifted slightly away from the revolution, social media companies, who at that time sort of denied the power that disinformation had on their platforms, were also not pressed and not kept accountable for what is going on their social media platforms. And what was going on is essentially the same propaganda that we see now. Putin did not begin calling Ukrainians Nazis on February 22nd. He began that almost as soon as he took power and began that in earnest in 2014. And at that time, many Ukrainian activists and officials tried to get social media companies to listen to say, here's what Russian propaganda is, here's how your platforms are used, and here's what it does. I don't think I need to tell anybody in the room that those warnings were not heeded. And what we saw between then and now are the same cycles repeating themselves for 8 years. For more than that, really, because we saw the same cycle in Syria as well, and around the Arab Spring. And so right now, we are in the middle of that cycle. Again, on February 24th, the world's attention was on Ukraine. Even those without the personal stake were sharing ways to help, were amplifying Ukrainians on social media, were lobbying their politicians, were showing up to protests. Right now, the war is in its 43rd day. I don't even know what day of the week it is. But the attention to the war has changed. I would argue that, of course, many people have stepped away, but many people are also trying to figure out how to pay attention to it without putting their entire lives on hold, as they did in the early days. And social media companies are not equipped to adjust to that, because once again, this is the opportune time for disinformation to enter the conversation and to do real, serious, deep damage. And if the only way that we have of getting information from social media companies is governed by algorithms that figure out if they're going to serve you posts about Ukraine based on how much attention you pay, we will see that disappearance. And so this is a case where it's another cycle that really needs to be broken, because the war has not ended. And the demand for information around the war has actually not really ended either. So why do we have to continue to keep having this conversation for years? And how many more years do we have to keep this conversation going for?
Obviously, another front line is covering the big tech and that industry, which is, you know, becomes slightly problematic when so much of journalism is supported by the platforms today, right? But it's almost like a separate conversation, but tied to that as well. I mean, just to illustrate the point that you're making, I was talking to a colleague of mine in Georgia whose independent newsroom had a 90% dip in their engagement on Facebook because they're being reported by Russian trolls or pro-Russian trolls. So, like, what can we do, both as journalists and as individuals, to change that, to change the way that algorithms work? Peter, do you want to take it, or you decide?
I mean, I think there's a lot of consensus around this now. We've all been on this journey for 6 years now, and I think the EU regulations moving towards greater algorithmic transparency will, I assume, be a model for everyone else. I mean, in America, it's just a case of the very weird polarized system in America that's not allowing for consensus about regulation. I think actually among journalistic and sort of academic and the sort of expert groups, there is actually a lot of consensus about the need for algorithmic transparency and oversight. The question is some of the details. But I think in this moment, with this specific war, I think I'd like to see the tech platforms take a stance, actually. And it's not taking a geopolitical stance. It's taking a stance around the things that they claim to value, which is human rights, access to information, and connecting people, in that terrible phrase that Facebook, now known as Meta, has ruined for all of us. But what do I mean by that? They should be taking a stance on making sure that their apps deliver VPNs and other tools to circumvent firewalls to the Russian people, who are being sort of increasingly shut off from the global internet. They can do that. The Ukrainian digital minister has asked for much more. He says, look, most people in Russia have, phones powered by Google or by Apple. why can't you sort of like deliver the truth about what's going on in Ukraine, within, the facts about the humanitarian crimes being committed, or the crimes against humanity being committed. I can see the platforms not doing that. I can see them never seeding information, but making sure that people have access, designing new tools that will encourage dialogue across borders. I don't know, we will love this app that the Taiwanese use, Pol.is. Well, what would be like a secure version of that to make sure that the Russian people can keep on talking to people across the world? Those are all positions they can take based on their professed values and laws. They're not geopolitical choices, but that would mean they need to take a stance, saying we are for these things, and it is our duty to deliver these tools and provide these services especially to people in Russia. For that, well, maybe we can encourage them to do that.
I'll just add one more thing, which is there's a lot we understand about disinformation already that just hasn't been fixed. And one of the things that we understand, that has been particularly pronounced with COVID, is that moderation of these platforms has an ingrained inequality, where a lot of the moderation takes place in English, or a lot of it proactively takes place in Western countries. But when it comes to literally everybody else, that moderation takes a back seat. There's very little specialization. There are languages in which there are no moderators at all, including languages that are used in the war in Ukraine right now. And this inherent disinformation inequality, I think, is a deeply important thread for reporters to keep pulling on. Because it means that propaganda works better in some parts of the world than others. That is something that is solvable. That is something that is solvable by these companies not just investing in algorithmic transparency, which is an incredibly important part of the solution, but also adding human power to our information environment, which is deeply, deeply needed, which is a financial investment, and also not just adding human power, but providing moderators with resources, with context, with time, with mental health support, with fair salaries, so that they are able to respond to wars, revolutions, crises, breaking news events as they happen, and not flounder after the fact.
Well, I very much hope that Meta is listening. We know that they're here. We have a few questions from the audience, and again, I promise I'll try to get to as many as I can. This one, I think, well, both of you, Peter, you just come back. Jane, you have family in Ukraine. You both have family in Ukraine. So the question is, you have mentioned how we should teach foreign newsrooms how to cover the war, but what about teaching newsrooms how to humanize the war victims? How can we realize as journalists that these people are not only stories, but also people? And how can we mirror that in our reporting?
Peter, you want to start?
So there's very specific things like how do you, and I think journalists need training on that, how do you make sure that you don't re-traumatize people as you get them to talk about traumatic events? Also, having seen a lot of journalists in situations like this, in Syria, in Libya, Afghanistan, actually journalists need training as well as about how to look after themselves. A lot of them, end up soaking up a lot of this horror and don't recover. So there's a lot of, we need a lot more psychological training. But then I think the project that I and the war reporter Janine DiGiovanni are just launching in Ukraine is all about sort of enabling witnesses to sort of tell the testimony that they're going to tell about these events. A lot of them do want to tell it, by the way. People are coming out of Bucha saying, I want to tell you what happened. But then doing it in a way which isn't just a good story and a good click, but starting to integrate it with a little bit of legal practice as well. So to make sure that you're doing it in a way that actually can be used for transitional justice. That doesn't mean you stop thinking about it as a story, and actually storytelling is going to be key to the transitional justice piece. But maybe some of that would make the experience just a little bit more focused and a little bit rooted in something more than just the quick story. So I think especially in Ukraine, we've had some of this experience in Syria, but often a bad experience, doing that straight away. So trying to make sure that if you're going to go to these very dark places and take people on these horrific journeys about their recent experience, that you're doing in a way that A, doesn't re-traumatize them, B, doesn't traumatize you, and C, is already strong legally. So you're actually doing it with a real intentionality. And I'd like to see sort of journalism and law and sociology come together a lot more generally.
You know, I think this question is also a little bit about war voyeurism. I think like how, because that's something that I personally struggle with is, you know, especially in that age of sort of information on steroids and social media and all this, and everyone having mobile phones and tweeting from the bomb shelters and so on. Like, how do you avoid that? Like how it's so powerful, and the story of Ukraine is so powerful, but it can also become dehumanizing at the end, right? It kind of normalizes that. Like, how do you walk that line?
You know, there's this series of images that I saw on Instagram, and unfortunately I don't have the name of the artist pulled up. But they show a bombed-out house in Kiev. And on each floor of that bombed-out house, somebody's cooking dinner, or watching television, or playing with their cat. And I found that to be a very powerful illustration, because these are just normal lives interrupted, right? These are just normal lives. And I think there's a lot of traps that we can fall into as reporters, not just by painting Ukrainians as victims, but also overly lionizing Ukrainians, making Ukrainians these superhumans, right? Who can withstand anything, who can do anything, who can beat this gargantuan threat. And neither of those are really accurate narratives, because Ukrainians are not superhuman, and they're also not just victims. They're regular people. And practically, you know, don't just ask Ukrainians about what they've been through, although by all means collect the evidence, tell their stories, but also ask them about what they used to do on a Friday night. What their hobbies were, you know, where was their favorite coffee shop. It's really important to remember that these are just people going through something unimaginably terrible.
I mean, I think that's such an important point, and also relating that to the context of Putin's aims in the war. One of his aims is to sort of turn Ukraine into this sort of into a wasteland defined by war. I was just in Ukraine last week, and actually 80% of the country is actually functional, and everybody's stressed out, obviously, but you know, the country's still living, and normal lives weirdly are continuing, and many normal services are functioning. But Putin's aim is to create it in really the world's imagination into this kind of wasteland. And actually by reinforcing that over and over and over again, you're actually doing some of his work. I mean, he wants it to be a wasteland where nothing can grow, and this country has no hope and no future and no identity. So we have to be very careful, actually, by just reinforcing war, Ukraine all the time, that we're not actually falling into his trap. And Vorzel, which is, you know, is a really nice sort of like, I don't know, leafy excerpt of Kiev, where like writers and, you know, people in the creative industries have their little dachas. It's where you go if you want a little place just outside Kiev. Now in the public like in the world's imagination, is just sort of associated with death and horror and terror. And it's not. And we have to make sure that it doesn't remain that way. And that takes a lot of skill, but also understanding context. It's about humanizing, but also understanding that this is a kinetic war, but the Russians, I suppose everybody, but especially the Russians, always think in terms of narrative. They're always doing a piece of storytelling. And you have to be very careful not to get sucked up into exactly the storytelling that Putin wants.
So many questions now coming in. So this one is Western. Do you feel, and you two may be the wrong people to ask this, but do you feel that the Western media response has been too one-sided and too single narrative?
Too one-sided and too single narrative. Look, I really hope we're growing out slowly from this, what we like to say was a journalistic virtue, but was actually an excuse to not ask tough moral questions and simplify journalism to here's one side, here's the other side. I mean, I cover propaganda in a lot of my work, and that was the curse of the climate change debate. You're like, oh, here's the facts about climate change, and here's some guy who's being funded, we don't know by who, but he says climate change doesn't work. And we sort of said that was a virtue, that was journalistic virtue. And it wasn't. It was just either good theater, let's have a Punch and Judy game, 5 minutes to Hitler and 5 minutes to the Jews. But also it was a kind of a moral weakness and an intellectual weakness. We couldn't be bothered finding out the truth. I really hope we're moving beyond that. And that doesn't mean that you don't have pluralism, that you don't have many voices. I'm sure we're leaving out many voices from the story, by the way. And we need to constantly be thinking about what is a truly pluralistic form of storytelling. But to reduce it to sort of like two sides, I really hope we're beyond that now.
So I'm going to complicate that question a little bit with another question, since you're all for complicating and giving more nuance. How do you deal, and this links back to the, my initial question about, what do you say to people for whom, who got their other wars that they worry about? How do you deal with the Iraq war question or other comparisons with US military actions around the world? Supporters of Ukraine say that that's whataboutism. But the reality is that in the world outside the West, whataboutism is a thing. And that's why so many people outside the West, and the previous question came actually from a listener, viewer, in the West as well, but also so many people outside the West see this as a Western war and either back Putin or they are on the fence. So what about whataboutism? It may be wrong, but it's powerful. Who would like to take it?
I'd separate two things. There are the professional propagandists whose job is to muddy the waters because they have a political aim usually associated with the Russian state or its proxies or other dictatorships who do not want to talk about this war for their own very, very greedy reasons. Those people you just ignore. Yeah, they're trying to... And then there are very, very...
George Galloway, so this one.
Who? But that's just... We don't need to bother with them. They're trying to sort of pollute the debate. There are very genuine questions to ask about Iraq, about Syria, about history. I think we talk about these questions. I think they're very, very valid questions. The thing I would never do, though, and that happens a lot, is sort of do it without Ukrainians giving their point of view, because their voice really matters. And over many, many years, their voice was sort of non-existent. In the conversation. So make sure they're there in that plural conversation. But I live in Washington, D.C., where I think Iraq is on everybody's minds all the time. And whenever Ukrainians come and go, well, can you do more? Can you do more? They say, well, Iraq, we messed up over Iraq. And America, I think the problem in America is that it never really went through a process of really analyzing what went wrong and getting over it, learning the lessons and moving beyond it. And in many ways, Syrians had to pay for that, because America hadn't dealt with its own sins in Iraq, and it became kind of a blocker analyzing what's happening in Syria, and sort of now Ukrainians are paying the price.
But is it too late now? Or is it just not the time?
Living in America is very... I mean, the way societies get over these awful things that they've done is by telling the story of what happened, saying who was guilty, punishing them, learning the lessons and moving beyond. No one in America has ever taken accountability for what happened. And so they're just stuck in this internal conversation, and everything is about Iraq. And sadly, and I think it's a great pity, America plays a huge role in the world. And it was surreal watching the Syria thing, where Syrians had to pay for the fact that Americans had never managed to find somebody guilty in their own system for Iraq. You know, it works. So there's a very nuanced conversation to have, which is, I think, you know, especially America has not had.
But is it happening, or is it not?
No. I think they still completely haven't faced up to what they did, and therefore can't move beyond it, and therefore it blocks clear thinking.
And I would also say this is a place where journalism continues to have deep opportunities, right? Because so much accountability is driven by good investigative journalism, uncovering what happened, when, and who was responsible. And this for reporters, I think means stretching our investigative muscles a lot. Because America's role in the world is deeply complicated. And I think you're right. You know, there definitely absolutely needs to be an understanding of what America's role in the world is. But also not just America, right? Russia's role in the world has also been deeply complicated, and the relationship between Russia and the US and the various wars or conflicts around the world and how Russia and the US play into that has also been deeply complicated. A lot of it has been examined, and a lot of it hasn't. And what you were talking about earlier, where there's a real opportunity to explain to our audiences where certain events figure into what we're living through now, I think is incredibly important, because many years have passed since the Iraq War, right? And time has continued to flow. Relentlessly, it continues to flow. And it's not too late to try to understand what the different components that are figuring into the global situation now are.
So we've got quite a few front lines, right, that have emerged. The big tech, climate change, LGBTQ, historical memory over Iraq. Information, disinformation is another front line, which especially, and Putin's propaganda may not be working so well in the West, but you know, we've done some reporting on how they're really targeting more sympathetic countries and audiences right now, and it seems to be working just fine in Russia. How would you do about that?
About engaging with Russian audiences?
Yes.
So, obviously thinking about this a lot. I spent a lot of time living in Russia and working in Russia, and many of the Russian journalists, most of whom have left the country, are my very good friends. Well, there's a couple of things. One, this has happened before in Russia, where like there's a mass emigration of people with democratic values, and the problem has always been they would create media abroad, and they became their own bubble. They lost contact, they lost relevance, and even if they had an effect, it was very, very slow. So I think right now we're in this very interesting moment where, and this is not my term, this was Roman Badanyan's term, who's the editor of a now exiled Russian media called Projekt. He called it offshore journalism. There are so many opportunities now, even if you're outside the country, to stay in touch through, you know, secure messaging apps, through OSINT, through analytics of data. There's just so many ways that you can still be in touch. And really the challenge they're all thinking about is like, how do we become offshore media rather than exile media? How do we kind of remain in country when not in country? And Medusa have been doing this very well for several years. They're based in Riga, but they feel as if they're based in, feels as if they're based in Russia. So we really have to think about how that's done and find out, I hate this language, best practices and know-how, and spread that around. It's a real kind of, it's a moment of great innovation. So there's that. But then there's, those media have their audiences that they want to keep. They might be able to grow them a little bit. But then there's a sort of much larger Russian audience who, as far as we can tell, is not against the war. Yeah. And that's a bigger challenge. How do you engage them? How do you start a conversation with them? And I wonder whether, painful as it is for me to say that, whether the war is the topic that you engage them on. Yeah, the war, we kind of know what the polarization is already. There's like 15% of people are against it, and all this polling in dictatorships is very, very flimsy, but we have a sense socially like where people stand. The information is out there. It's not because they don't have the information, it's because they've made a choice because of fear, because of patriotism, because of Kremlin propaganda. They've made a choice about where they stand on this conflict. However, there are many other issues that are sort of bubbling through in Russian society, and which will bubble through much faster, around how sanctions for ordinary people are going to mean something else than sanctions for the elite, about looming crises in the health sector. That's already a crisis that's sort of brewing due to the lack of kind of medicine because of the sanctions. So these are all topics that people want to talk about, that they care about, and that you need good journalism on, and that you need good information on and good discussion on. So I think that the instinct of all democratic media is to go war, war, war. I suspect if you want to talk to more people, you're going to have to do more than war and talk about these other things as well. And the conversations that you can have, can actually be very productive. So I think that's the way to go. What I'd like us to avoid is this sort of mythologizing the power of Russian propaganda. So there's all these stories about people phoning home, or Ukrainians phoning their aunts in Russia, and she says, I don't believe that, there are any bombs falling. All this kind of instant rejection. I understand why people are doing this. The stories are heartbreaking because families are being torn apart. If we were ever to do, let's say, a project where you're trying to bring somebody out of a cult, or out of a situation where they're resisting knowledge in many ways, whether it's QAnon or climate change denialism or something else, that's not the way you do it. That is the last thing you do, is bombard them with something they don't want to accept. You would never start that way. You would never make it one phone call. This is a process 6 months and months and months. So I completely understand why people are doing this, and it's certainly not a bad thing to try. But we're kind of, there's a bit of a mood like, oh, we can't do anything. These people are zombified by Russian propaganda. That's not how it works. It really isn't how it works. Nobody's brainwashed. All these categories don't exist. It's a complicated set of psychological motivations, and often motivations to do with survival. The truth might be dangerous for you. So I wouldn't rush to kind of giving Putin's propaganda this permanent, all-powerful aura. There are many, many ways through, but it does take patience and sort of time.
The two things that Putin has, or at least used to have, patience and time.
I completely disagree. I think he's on quicksand, but I'm in a minority to think that.
Jane, apparently Russians have not been brainwashed. Do you want to argue with that?
Hardly. No, I also want to maybe underscore the point that was made earlier, which is the deep tragedy of social media outlets being blocked in Russia. Because a lot of the information is on social media, right? A lot of the way that the information flows is through social media. And so we need to figure out ways that are technologically accessible, that are easy enough to engage in that gets the accurate information that Peter's talking about, that gets the reporting, the actual delivery system of the reporting to people within Russia.
We're running out of time. We started 5 minutes late. Do we have a couple more minutes for one more question, or do we wrap up? Organizers, anyone? Okay, I'll do one more.
We'll just do it.
Why, we'll just do it if we're... Yeah,
All right.
we do. Exactly. So there's a question about the future of Russian journalism, which I think was kind of addressed. There's so many, sorry, not very prepared. I'm just trying to find. Jane, question for you. So much of the disinformation coming out of Ukraine pits the Ukrainian military as brutalists, Nazi narratives, etc. What's the best way to combat this type of disinfo, especially as reporters, fact-checkers are not able to confirm every video and every photo?
I think this is where the power of open source investigative journalism has proved particularly potent. So gathering evidence of photos, videos on social media, using that to reconstruct the scene to try to understand what happened has been a very, very powerful anti-propaganda weapon. And the reason why it's powerful is because you're not relying on anonymous sourcing or only people's recollections, although of course they're important, but the hard evidence that we're able to gather. And there's a massive effort from Ukrainians to gather hard evidence of what's happening on the ground and put it on social media. That is a conscious effort. Although, of course, there's also some informational inequality there because it is widely understood both inside the country and out that showing images of Ukrainian army movements might be putting them in danger. But over the last decade or so, this style of journalism has evolved and grown. And now it's embedded in traditional newsrooms. Of course, if anybody from Bellingcat is here, their work is, of course, globally familiar. But it's also something that hobbyists and specialists have been able to do as well. To do geolocation that can then be fact-checked, to do evidence gathering that can then be fact-checked. And so I would say that with any newsroom that has resources to invest in that, that has proven itself to be a deeply worthwhile investment that counters these narratives.
Is there a dark side to it that newsrooms need to be aware of, though?
Yeah, of course. There's a dark side to everything. The first thing is, of course, it takes a terrible mental health toll on many of the reporters who do it, particularly with how violent the imagery is. And also for people who are not knowledgeable in the methods of this field, it's easy to manipulate. So we actually see Russian propagandists claim that they're doing open source investigations without actually doing open source investigations and convince their audiences that way as well.
I'm very aware of the time, so I think we do need to wrap up. Peter, do you want anything you want to add at the end? Either of you?
Well, I have so much. I can go on and on. You know me. I
know,
won't stop.
that's
What do
why
you want me to stop?
I'm giving you a
I think.
I'm giving you a minute to wrap up.
I don't know. Look. Our whole conversation has been under the sort of shadow of the moment of silence at the start and Oksana's murder and the other journalists. I just want to reiterate just how Oksana was killed. The Russians, she was in Kiev. She wasn't like in a very dangerous place in the front line. I was in Kiev. I came a day later it seemed fine. I mean, you could hear artillery in the distance, but it didn't seem a dangerous place in any explicit way. And the Russians hit a shopping center where they seemed to believe there were some weapons. The next day, journalists went there. I think Tim Judah was there, she was there. Like, a bunch of people went down there to film it, and they hit it again. And that's what they did in Syria over and over and over. It's double taps. This has to stop. I mean, we just can't let it happen over and over and over again. And yes, it's something very similar happening in Yemen as well, but this sort of slide to accepting humanitarian fallout from war, which has been growing and growing and growing and growing year after year after year after year, is something we have to make some sort of collective effort to stop.
I'll just add one more thing, which is that the reason why the disinformation industry exists, why the propaganda industry exists, why one of the first resources that Russian troops rush to cut when they besiege a town is the internet and the communication resources. They're taking people's phones, is because information is powerful. Journalism is powerful. There's a reason why authoritarians fear it. And there's a reason why our jobs are dangerous. And that's also the same reason why we have to keep doing those jobs. Yes, in Ukraine, and also everywhere.
Peter, Jane, thank you so much.
Every kiss, every hug seems to act just like a drug. You're getting to be a habit with me. Let me stay in your arms. I'm addicted to your charms. You're getting to be a habit with me. I used to think